The year is 1983. Challenger completes its maiden flight, the first working 3D printer is created, and the video game industry implodes. This was the year of the infamous video game crash, which saw thousands of unsold Atari cartridges buried in the desert, which were then unearthed about 30 years later, but let's not get too deeply into that. Despite that seemingly catastrophic event, video games were actually alive and well outside of a specific sector. In the UK, the home computer revolution was in full swing, with the big three competitors duking it out on the battlefield of score playgrounds. And in Japan, a fascinating little system called the Family Computer saw its initial release, a system that would turn the world of gaming on its head and bring about a new kingpin in the industry. Computers, on the other hand, were on the rise, and by 1983, home systems were more affordable than ever. Crucially, it was far easier to write and distribute software for computers, requiring only a floppy disk instead of a proprietary cartridge, making this the ideal space for hobbyist game developers to cut their teeth. One of those developers was Doug E. Smith, a student at the University of Washington, and what started out as a small summer project turned into one of the longest legacies in video games. Welcome, friends, to Lode Runner. Lode Runner is a platformer, not that the term had quite found its footing yet. The goal, as with most games at the time, is to clear a screen and move on to the next one. But rather than clear a screen of enemies, the goal is to collect all of the gold. The gold that is unfortunately guarded by a handful of, guards. Being a 1983 computer game, the graphics are a little on the primitive side. All of the characters are stick figures, and the gold, well, you could argue that it's a little stack of bullion, but it could be anything, frankly. Anyway, it seems a little harsh to rail on graphics from such a game. The point is, the guards aren't especially well defined and kind of just look like clones of the player. The manual sheds a little light on the concept here. You play as a galactic commando attempting to play Robin Hood against the supposedly evil bungling empire. While you don't have any method of attack, or even the ability to jump, who do you think you are, Mario? You're not entirely defenceless. Equipped with what the manual refers to as a laser drill pistol, which is apparently powerful enough to blast human-sized holes in solid brick, but not powerful enough to blast human-sized holes in humans, you can create traps for your would-be assailants. Time it right and you can, sort of, kill them, although your victory is short-lived as they will instantly respawn elsewhere in the level. Speaking of levels, there are 150 of them. Remember, this is a world in which it's impressive that arcade games have 4 levels. To be faced with one that gives you 150 out of the box, plus a fully featured level editor, was kinda mind-blowing at the time. In fact, Lode Runner is one of the first to include such a feature. Not actually the first, since Pinball Construction Set had been released the year prior, but certainly the first of its kind. Ostensibly, the game's a platformer, but after playing for a while, you realise it's more of a puzzle game. While you can get by just beelining towards the gold and reacting to the oncoming guards, some of the later levels require the player to really plan and optimise their approach. Many of them, in fact, have only one solution. This is largely down to the design of the levels, making certain terrain approachable from only one direction, stairs for instance, but it's also a feature of the unusual enemy AI. You see, the AI in the game is all part of the puzzle. It's very predictable. Notice for instance how the guards select the paths, and note how sometimes they just stop dead in the tracks. Essentially, the guards calculate the shortest distance to the player in each direction, and pick which they think will be the quickest approach. Thing is, if the path is blocked or otherwise inaccessible, they won't consider any other options and will just stay put. Knowing how to manipulate them based on your position on the screen can be helpful in solving a level, crucial even in some circumstances. Of course, let's not forget that you can also trap the enemies. Doing so takes them out of play for a few seconds, during which time the player can use them as a platform. Youch! On occasions, the guards will also collect gold themselves. Trapping them will cause them to drop it on their heads? Sure. This also goes back to the idea that the player can kill an enemy, but in some situations the guards are placed in specific enough locations that having one respawn on the other side of the level can render it unbeatable. Oh, also you can die by falling into your own traps, so don't do that. Now, if you're familiar at all with the arcade scene of the early 80s, you've likely seen this sort of format before. The design of the game is heavily reminiscent of 1981's premiere hit Donkey Kong, with its levels and ladders gameplay. In fact, early in its development, Lode Runner was a Donkey Kong clone. But before that, it was a Space Panic clone. Space Panic? What the heck is that, you might be wondering? Well, let me show you. Look familiar? There's a bit of a strange through line here, so let me try and disseminate it as best I can. In 1979, a little game was released called Heiankyo Alien, a game that I really should have mentioned in Pac-Man Hits 40, but never mind that. It's a game in which you dig holes to trap enemies, and it's played from an overhead perspective. Space Panic is that game but from a side-on perspective. Sometime later, a student at the University of Washington was enthusing to his friend about an arcade game he'd played recently. That friend was a guy called James Bratsanos, and the arcade game was likely to have been Space Panic, which led Bratsanos to develop a game based on that description for the Commodore PET called Suicide, a lovely title. Bratsanos then met two other students, one of whom was called Tracy Steinbeck, who we unfortunately won't hear much from again, and the other was our friend Doug Smith, who, to make a bit of money during his studies, had taken a part-time job in the uni computer lab. Together they iterated on Suicide and turned it into the aforementioned Donkey Kong clone, imaginatively called Kong, which they hid in an otherwise unassuming graphing program for the university's VAX computers. The popularity of the game caused Smith's nephew, who sometimes visited the university, to demand a version of the game he could play at home on his Apple II. Smith eventually gave in and ported the game over, referring to this new version as Minor. Towards the end of 1982, he used that game to sign a deal with software giant Broderbund, and between then and June 1983, developed Lode Runner into the game we ended up with. Phew, what a story. The game was an instant success. Critics at the time were extremely impressed, regularly handing out scores anywhere between 80 and 100% across its various conversions. According to Smith in a 1999 interview with everyone's favourite publication IGN, the game sold around 200,000 copies, a significant number in those days. And that was just for the Apple II. Lode Runner was released on all the major platforms of the day, and all of them play pretty much the same with various visual differences unique to each system. Smith predicts that the Japanese market accounted for around 80% of the game's sales, specifically its Famicom release by Hudson Soft. All in, Lode Runner shipped somewhere in the region of 3 million copies. We should take a quick look at that Famicom conversion. Obviously it's such a big screaming deal that it'd be remiss of me not to demonstrate it. And it's, well, Lode Runner. The graphics have seen a notable improvement and the characters look a bit more like they belong in a video game. In fact, it's a lot more reminiscent of an arcade game of the time, and a testament to the leap in technology represented by the Famicom. You may not be able to tell, but the controls are also massively improved. It's a lot more responsive, but it also makes a lot more sense. In the Apple II original, pressing a key to move right would cause your intrepid commando to continue running indefinitely until you told them to stop. Not especially intuitive. The Famicom does it the way we all expect, and it's much more playable as a result. The higher res graphics do unfortunately mean that the whole playfield doesn't fit on a single screen anymore. To make matters worse, it's a little lax with the scrolling, meaning you're not always sure of what you're about to run into until you run into it. Otherwise, it's pretty much a straight improvement. There were also conversions for the Atari 8-bit series, the Commodore 64, the VIC-20 and IBM PCs as a booter program. Unlike many of the previous games we've looked at in this show, these conversions all play pretty much identically, owing to the fact that there wasn't quite as much difference between the hardware as there is when arcade games are involved. Later on there were further conversions to the ZX Spectrum, Atari ST, Macintosh and, you know what, pretty much any system you could get your hands on in the late 80s. It probably played Lode Runner. Amiga fans had to make do without, sadly. Capitalising on the game's success, Broderbund produced a follow-up containing, in their words, 50 of the most intricate and challenging treasury rooms ever designed. Championship Lode Runner is more of the same, literally, so there's not a great deal to say about it. However, completion of the game would reward you with a special code, which when sent off to Broderbund on the enclosed registration card, would certify you as a champion Lode Runner.
Greetings, my name is Jason Perlo. I'm a technology journalist. Lode Runner was one of the very first computer games I've ever played. I first encountered it on the Apple II platform in, 1983, the year of its release. On CGA, not even CGA, on green phosphor screen graphics for the very first time. And of course, Broderbund was a huge publisher of computer games at the time. I'd also played Choplifter and a few others. At the time, I was probably, 12 years old, 13 years old, when I first encountered it in my first computer. And I had friends coming over to play it. It was one of the earliest platformer, ladder games. It came, I think, 2 years after Donkey Kong in the arcades. We didn't have a port of Donkey Kong on the Apple II at the time. Broderbund had basically, built this game from scratch with completely unique gameplay, different from Donkey Kong. But it was fun to play, and it was the whole concept of digging the holes, and what the acid recovery was doing, and dumping it, making your enemies fall in the holes, was a lot of fun. And it was an addictive game. It was a very hard game to play. There was a lot of action elements to it, a lot of reflexes. You had to be very fast. You had to really pay attention to be good at the game. And I don't know if I was particularly good at it, but it was fun. Certainly, the culture at the time was, kids, gathering at each other's houses. And also actually did quite a lot of copying of these games early for piracy, swapping these things, because these games, were probably $50, $60, $70 a piece, which was a lot of money in, $1983. So there's a lot of that went along at the time. So when I think of Lode Runner, I think of my time at, 13 years old. After school, or playing, bringing our discs, our floppy disks to the library to play it on the machines. I've also played it on other systems that my friends had. The Atari 800 and the Commodore 64 obviously were great systems for Broderbund games as well. That's what I remember. Early video games on computers, on home computers. So lots of kids, doing that, and then going out to play, Dungeons and Dragons and going after pizza or whatnot. It's the games of my youth. Thanks a lot.
Of course, a game as wildly and instantly popular as Lode Runner couldn't go unsequeled. As with all my Hits 40 shows, I'm not going to be able to talk about every Lode Runner game. Especially in this case, because the thing about Lode Runner is, there's loads of it. Seriously, loads. I don't really understand it myself. You wouldn't think it to be one of the biggest names in the industry. As a name, it's nowhere near as recognisable as the likes of Pac-Man or Mario. But the fact is, there are more Lode Runner games by far than, for example, Space Invaders games. They just kept making them. So, if I miss one of your favourite entries in this series, please do pop a comment in and let us know what you think of it. After its initial wave of releases, ranging from its original Apple II incarnation to such exotic platforms as the PC-98, the SG-1000 and the Sharp MZ-80B, Broderbund began to license out the Lode Runner concept to seemingly anyone who wanted it. We've already established that Japan loved a bit of Lode Runner, owing to the success of the Famicom release, and arcade specialists IREM, later known for a little thing called R-Type, were keen to give them more of what they wanted. Particularly since, while the Famicom was itself a massive seller, a home console was still a new concept, and an expensive one. As such, the arcades remained highly accessible, and throwing a few yen at an arcade cabinet was for some a much better value proposition than dropping the equivalent of £400 on a shiny new console. Essentially, IREM's arcade release represents a refined version of what we've already seen. The controls are much tighter and more responsive than on the Apple II, the graphics are much more detailed and colourful, and there's even music. Unfortunately, we only have 30 levels this time around, but on the other hand, it's an arcade game, not the sort of thing you'd spend hours upon hours in front of. But IREM weren't done running loads. The following year, they'd already got a sequel out the door. Titled The Bungling Strikes Back, it's the same thing again with different enemies and new levels. And then they made another one! The Golden Labyrinth sees our intrepid galactic commando doing the same thing as they did in the previous two games, but with different enemies and more new levels. I suspect by now you're noticing a pattern. So you won't be surprised to know that the fourth game, can't pronounce this. Teikoku Karano Dashutsu, is the same flipping thing again. This time it was exclusive to Japan. Clearly the West had got bored of IREM's borderline confidence trick by 1986, and it introduces a simultaneous two-player mode, a nice addition that makes sense in the environment of an arcade. This would be the end of IREM's Lode Runner escapades, but there would be one more arcade title in the series. Released in 2000, Lode Runner The Dig Fight features some impressive animation work, in a pre-rendered 3D style that looks more like it belongs in a real arcade game. It's also got a few extra tricks up its sleeve, which lend themselves to an overall more puzzly experience. Specifically, the ability to rebuild blocks at will after digging them, allowing the player to trap enemies quickly or undo any unfortunate misfires. This seemingly innocuous change opens up some unique opportunities vis-a-vis the game's level design. Between that and the pushable blocks, it feels just different enough to be worth a look while still retaining its core Lode Runner foundations. Speaking of things being the same darn thing again, you may well have noticed a pattern emerging. Lode Runner had a bit of what I like to call a Gallagher problem. See, our friend Doug had made a game that achieved everything it set out to do. Insofar as a game can be perfect, he'd made the perfect video game. A few tiny control-based tweaks aside, Lode Runner was the sort of game that if you add anything to it, you risk upsetting the balance of a very finely tuned, very complete experience. So what did Broderbund do? They just, threw more levels at it. I invite you to observe Super Lode Runner, released for the Famicom Disk System in 1987. Looks familiar, doesn't it? This one's a conversion of Irem's arcade games, so I suppose we can give it a pass. Let's move on to Hyper Lode Runner, which slipped onto the Game Boy in 1989. Very, very similar, and extremely harsh too. From the very start you're dealing with some seriously fiendish puzzles, but otherwise it's the same again. Battle Lode Runner for the PC Engine has a couple of unique twists, and if you've ever gone hunting for recommendations on retro party games, you may well have come across it before. As well as apparently being a time travel game, always a questionable sign. Hey! It features a variety of multiplayer modes, which pretty much all involve trying to trap each other in pits. Fundamentally, it's no different from any other Lode Runner thus far, but the multiplayer aspect does make it a bit more of a value proposition. And you can keep going. Pick a system, any system, from the late 80s or 90s, chances are you're going to find a Lode Runner game or two, and the chances even higher that it's a virtually untouched iteration of Doug Smith's perfect little platformer. So what the heck's going on here exactly? Why on earth are there so many Lode Runner games? And more to the point, what was going on in Japan? I'm picturing crowds of salarymen descending upon the streets of Akihabara, foaming at the mouth demanding their next cave-dwelling tunnel-digging fix. Well, while there isn't really a definitive answer on that subject, one could speculate that the game's firm but fair difficulty level, its blend of action and puzzle gameplay, and its similarity to older arcade games that were themselves big in Japan, were all contributing factors. This speculation is brought to you by Sheila Borton, the president of Totozai Games, current license holders for the Lode Runner franchise. In a 2019 interview with Polygon, she says that the game's Japanese success was down to the idea that Western players give up more easily than Japanese players do. It just seems that there's more persistence from Japanese players. This is corroborated by Totozai's chief advisor Scott Sumura, who goes on to say that Japanese gamers like puzzles, so the game seems suited to Japanese players. I'm not sure I agree 100% with that, since Japanese games were famously made more difficult for Western markets around the time of Lode Runner's release. Whatever the case though, Japan loved themselves a bit of Lode Runner, to the extent that Hudson's release was the first third-party Famicom game to exceed 1 million sales. So, to answer the question as to why it ended up everywhere, I guess its obvious massive popularity and its relative simplicity as a game made it a ripe target for conversions. It also helps that you can adapt it to basically any theme or graphical style, and it'll still work as a game. That's not to say that all the Lode Runner games were completely identical. Alright, most were. But amongst the 80s console releases, there was one notable exception. A little home computer game called Lode Runner's Rescue. You'll recall that in the original game, you played as a character referred to only as the Galactic Commando. Well, according to this game, that guy was actually called Lode Runner. Talk about names matching job titles. Anyway, he's apparently been captured by the Bungling Empire, and his daughter Alexandra is the only one who can rescue him. Straight off the bat, there's an obvious difference between this and previous Lode Runners. It's isometric! The goal is to run around each level and collect all the keys. And the cat. You can also eat mushrooms to grow taller, which allows Alexandra to jump further and fall from greater heights. No fire flowers here though. You may have noticed a glaring omission, however. It seems that in his wisdom, so-called Lode Runner hasn't entrusted his intrepid daughter with the power of the laser drill pistol, meaning you can't trap your enemies. In fact, outside of the name there isn't much resemblance to Lode Runner at all, and it's actually a lot closer to the arcade game Crystal Castles released 2 years prior. Based on the aesthetics, one might even argue that this game was supposed to be some sort of Alice in Wonderland pastiche. Lode Runner's Rescue was published by Synapse Software, which was founded in 1981 and mainly focused on the Atari 8-bit series of home computers. Except in a shocking twist, Synapse was actually bought out by Broderbund in 1984 following financial difficulties. So really it was published by Broderbund themselves using the Synapse label. Unfortunately, there isn't a great deal of information out there beyond that, and while magazines of the time also noted the disconnect between title and gameplay, it was received well regardless. And it's still got a level editor, so I think we can give it a pass. Just like in the previous decade, the contemporary crop of consoles throughout the 90s each got their fair share of Lode Runner. 1990's Lode Runner The Lost Labyrinth is a very bog-standard Lode Runner conversion, which stars a very mincing hero against an army of mutons. The graphics are crisp and colourful as one would expect from a PC Engine game, but it's nothing new and critics at the time were quick to point that out. 1994's Lode Runner Twin for the Super Famicom looks like it might be a bit different. Unfortunately, the only thing separating this from its 11-year-old Apple II ancestor is a cutesy art style and graphics that you can't easily read. That's not to say it doesn't look good. The characters are expressive, the levels are varied, and the backgrounds are nicely detailed. Thing is, a game like Lode Runner can actually suffer from too much detail, given that you need to be aware of what's going on across the whole playfield at any given moment. Speaking of which, we've run into a pinball problem here. The game is so zoomed in that you can't see the entire level. The minimap does help, but it only gets you so far. Sorry, but scrolling still sucks. 1999's Power Lode Runner takes things a step further by, letting you play as a cat. Not a cat in a cardboard box spaceship though. Instead of collecting gold, you're stealing fruit from a horde of angry monkeys. But beneath a colourful veneer, it's uncannily similar to the game we've already played like 10 times already. Oh yes, and there was a Windows 3 conversion of the game in 1994. Surely this one can't be much different, right? Okay, gameplay pretty standard so far. The controls are responsive, the graphics are detailed but clear and readable, and you can see the entire playfield at once. Alright, I'm teasing you a little bit. This little game was a shareware demo for a much bigger game. Namely, Lode Runner, The Legend Returns. Not that the legend ever went away. Kinda like the whole pack is back business. Developed by... Presage? You know what, whichever one I pick is invariably going to be wrong, so I'll just go with Presage. Developed by Presage Software and published by Sierra Online alongside Jeff Tunnel Productions. The Legend Returns is the breath of fresh Lode Runner air we've all been waiting for. But we're not going to play that one. Instead, we're going to play the follow-up that came only a year later. With the succinct and eloquent title Lode Runner Online: The Mad Monk's Revenge, this is effectively a straight upgrade to the previous game, keeping the gameplay basically intact while including a few extra features. On first glance, it looks like the same game we've come to grow slightly weary of actually. Instead of a galactic commando who may or may not be called Lode Runner, you play as the heroic adventurer Jake Peril in his grey onesie. The bungling empire is back, except instead of the unnamed guards of the previous games, we're now facing off against the crimson-robed mad monks. Get close enough to them and you'll find out what they mean by mad. You can still dig holes in the ground, you can still climb ladders and monkey bars, and you can still fall about 100 times your own height without feeling a thing. And there's still a level editor, of course. What sets this one apart are the additional traps you can lay down to further waylay the mad monks. In addition to your laser drill pistol, you can now find glue which will slow down anyone daft enough to walk across it, snare traps which will immobilise a monk for a brief period of time, and bombs which can be used to clear out whole areas of blocks and monks. Worth noting that while these traps are extremely useful, their effects aren't exclusive to the monks, so be careful where you lay those snares. There's also a gas canister that you can use to knock out a monk or two, and by far the most useful tool in Jake's repertoire, the jackhammer, which allows you to dig straight down. Would that I had this in Hyper Lode Runner. In fact, there are so many new features that it's hard to summarise them all without this just being a Legend Returns review. And while it all fits really well with the classic Lode Runner gameplay, there's enough here that it could quite easily be an entirely new game in its own right. These extra tools make the included 150 levels a lot more varied and interesting than ever before, with an additional 37 included with Mad Monk's Revenge. And much like Lode Runner Twin, over the course of the single-player adventure, you'll travel amongst a diverse range of locations and biomes, each with its own unique music track and tileset. There are even a handful of secret classic levels if you know where to look. And all of this new stuff is available in the level editor too, making for some incredible, and devious, creative opportunities. There's also a simultaneous 2-player mode, which we haven't seen much of in this series thus far. As the title alludes to, Mad Monk's Revenge also includes some online functionality, allowing you to play online, either over LAN or via modem. Originally, The Legend Returns was released for DOS, Windows, macOS and the Saturn. Mad Monk's Revenge, on the other hand, only came out on Windows 95 and macOS. You may be thinking that we're lacking the Japanese connection here. Indeed, this game was a wholly Western effort. Nevertheless, our friends in the Far East got their special Lode Runner treatment in the form of Lode Runner Extra. It's the same game again, but with 110 brand new levels to play on your PlayStation or Saturn. This level set would later return, much like The Legend, to the West in the form of the aptly named Lode Runner, a compilation disc of the original Legend Returns levels, plus the extra levels from Extra. Make sense? Good, let's move on. The Legend Returns may have been a tough act to follow, but Presage tried it anyway, and 5 years later gave us a brand new title called Lode Runner 2. What in the Namco numbering structure is this? Not only is this the 26th title in the Lode Runner series to date, but we already had Lode Runner 2 in the arcades as well as a Lode Runner 2 on the MSX. I can't help but think they could have come up with something a bit more descriptive. I guess it's to signify that it's a sequel to The Legend Returns, which is good because nothing else about this suggests it's related in any material sense. Particularly since our main character appears to be a beatnik Stephen King lookalike in a skin-tight chessboard onesie. Or an innocent flannel suit, if you will. And if you're wondering why his pose is so awkward, some releases of the game showed him with a laser drill pistol. Quite why that's the one element they decided to remove is anyone's guess, given it's a key part of the Lode Runner experience. The game opens to an exciting FMV sequence, which doesn't give us any further clues, but it's still kinda cool. Before you start, you get to pick your hero and the colour of their outfit. In-game, our beatnik friend looks more like a thin man from XCOM, and now I'm thinking that game would have been a lot easier with laser drill pistols. Speaking of XCOM, this game is isometric, which is a pretty novel concept. At least novel for a game that actually resembles Lode Runner. Gameplay-wise, it functions roughly identically to the Lode Runner we all know and love. You move from tile to tile, blasting holes in the ground to traverse and to trap the wandering monks, climb, dangle, collect gold, all that good stuff. The levels, once again, take place across a variety of locations and themes. From the classic jungle world to the delightfully chaotic wacky world, it's got a brilliant aesthetic that's indicative of that criminally brief period between 2D and 3D. Controlling the game is a bit awkward, and it takes some getting used to, since it's isometric, and isometric games are famously difficult to control at the best of times. Nevertheless, once you get the hang of it, it works really well and shows that Lode Runner can kind of work in 3D. Unfortunately, it does have the problem that you can't rotate the camera or anything like that. To get round this, if you're behind a wall, pillar, eyeball or anything that blocks your view, it'll go transparent around your character so you can kinda see where you're going. What's not always clear is if there's a tunnel or passage underneath blocks, simply because you just can't see them. There's also a bit of a depth perception problem, which is another issue often faced by isometric games. It's mitigated somewhat by a little indicator showing where your character will land if you jump off a ledge or let go of a vine, but sometimes it just feels a bit like you're looking at an MC Escher painting, and it can be a little difficult to navigate, particularly when you come across ledges that for some reason you can't walk off. What's the difference between this ledge and this ledge? Why am I blocked from one, but not the other? Lode Runner 2 also sees the triumphant return of the Mad Monks, complete with the classic gruesome death animations. They take a bit more of a back seat than the various guards we've previously seen. The game seems more about environmental puzzle solving, owing to that new third axis. In many cases you can run right past the monks, assuming your exits are clear of course. The puzzle design can sometimes be a bit infuriating though, and many puzzles just have you running around in circles picking up awkward bits of gold. Or perhaps I'm just not very efficient at these things. Most likely the latter, let's face it. There are even items, including a staggering variety of bombs which explode in various different shapes. These sorts of things add more complexity to the puzzles, although I do wonder if more complexity was what we needed, given that this is already so radically different to other Lode Runners. The 3D aesthetic changes so much that it might have been better just to play it straight. Thankfully there is a tutorial to get you to grips with the controls and the new features. Oh, and there's a level editor. It's a bit odd. The box claims that it's a sort of prototype level editor, but it also says the developers used it to make the levels on the disc. Anyway, they've also chucked a few unfinished bonus levels on there for you to tinker with. Lode Runner 2 goes to show how flexible the Lode Runner concept can be in the right hands. Sure, it's a bit clumsy to control, and sure, it can get a bit crowded and difficult to parse at times. I'd say it's not quite as pick up and play as previous efforts, but it's still a fascinating experience. And it's the first time we've had a playable female character in Lode Runner, not counting Lode Runner's Rescue, that is. One question remains. Is it a 3D platformer? That's something I'll have to answer another time. While Lode Runner 2's gameplay may have been a bit more three-dimensional than its predecessors, it certainly wasn't what you'd call a 3D game. Anyone who wanted a proper 3D Lode Runner would have to wait until the following year. They'd also have to own a Nintendo 64. The aptly titled Lode Runner 3D looks to have departed completely from any semblance of adventure, or indeed loads. Because, in case you're not aware, a lode is effectively another word for a vein of metallic ore, thus evoking images of the sort of hero who spelunks in caves to find hidden treasure. Lode Runner 3D, on the other hand, looks like it takes place in... space? I suppose that's not unwarranted, given the hero of the first game was known as the Galactic Commando. Okay, it's not as if previous Lode Runner games have given us any context whatsoever, and that's part of the beauty of them. You just jump right in and get straight to puzzling. But here, I feel more than ever like I need some context. Why am I running awkwardly around the Crash Bash level selection screen, for instance? So, the 3D-ness of Lode Runner 3D is apparent in the graphics. Rather than the understated pre-rendered beauty of the previous game, we have ourselves some proper polygons. And because it's a Lode Runner game, I'm going to cut them some slack for the floor tiles being little more than textured cuboids. What I do take issue with is the fact that I can only dig in the direction I'm facing. There is a reason that every game in the series has allowed us to dig in both directions. But not this game, it thinks it's above it all. And to make matters worse, you get flung backwards when you try to dig. As you can imagine, this makes for a rather frustrating experience. In terms of the three-dimensionality of its gameplay, it's a bit different to Lode Runner 2's approach. Certain levels have these junctions and crossroads where you can change direction, but otherwise you're effectively locked to a 2D plane. It's not bad, and it adds a little 3D spice to what is otherwise a fairly vanilla Lode Runner experience. You do get bombs though, which are essential for solving certain puzzles. Because, you know, the backblast problem. And the Mad Monks are back, making them probably the most consistent characters in the Lode Runner stable. This time they don't graciously allow you to watch while they eat your guts, at least not on camera. You also can't land on their heads, breaking another time-honoured Lode Runner rule. There is some enjoyment to be had here. Some of the puzzles are quite fun and inventive, even if others aren't a bit of a pain. It's just a bit of a slog to play when it gets down to it, but it's a serviceable Lode Runner at the end of the day, so I can't knock it that much. And it's got bosses! What more do you want? The experimentation with the third dimension didn't stop there, and a few years later we got another 3D Lode Runner for the next generation of consoles. Released in 2003 for the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube, this is Hudson's very own Cubic Lode Runner. Effectively, it's the original Famicom Lode Runner, but given the 3D treatment. Only took them 20 years. And it plays very, very similarly to Lode Runner 2. Even down to the extremely sneaky gold hidden in nooks and crannies that you can't see. The levels aren't anywhere near as expansive as they were in that older game, but they still have the capacity to be as inventive and devilish as ever. In fact, this is pretty much Lode Runner 2 played straight. You don't get bombs in this game, or even any items at all, and you only get one style of level, rather than the diverse biomes we saw from Presage's efforts. You get the classic Lode Runner gameplay with an extra dimension, and it works very well indeed. And you can blast in all four directions again, making it a distinct upgrade from Lode Runner 3D. There is one major playability issue though. You may well have spotted it yourself, but in case you haven't, it's that you still can't rotate the camera. Come on Hudson, you've made it 3D, act like it. Well, that's not strictly true. You can rotate up and down and you can zoom in and out, but if you want to see behind a block, you have to use the somewhat bizarre slice option to get a sort of X-ray view of the level. It's not a terrible idea, and it works best if you use it in the first instance to plan out your strategy. But it's no good if you need to see where the guards are, particularly on levels where you need to run behind the scenery, meaning you physically can't see where the guards could be. Speaking of whom, we've lost the Mad Monks again, in favour of these adorable little robots. I found them a lot harder to avoid in this game, partly due to the fact that they can approach you from any angle, and will sometimes just walk past your carefully laid traps. And partly because the levels are actually pretty compact, meaning you don't always have room to blast any holes in the ground. And even if you do trap them in a hole, they're much more eager to leave than you might expect. They also don't seem quite as predictable as they did in previous entries, which again could be down to the fact that they're taking advantage of the third dimension just as much as I am. Nevertheless, the reduced focus of this game makes for a more refined experience. Sure, you can clear most of the game's 60 levels in less than a minute each, and sure, you have to hear the same music loop every time, but each of those sub-minute solves is solidly built. And it's a budget game, so I think we can cut it some slack. Oh yeah, and the level editor, gotta mention that. It's a bit tricky to use, requiring the analog stick plus the GameCube's fiddly little D-pad, but it's as fully functional as the rest of the game. Welcome to the 2000s! We've got lots of shiny new handhelds, and a simple, low-stakes, pick-up-and-play action puzzler sounds like just the thing for such a system. 2002 saw the release of a brand new Lode Runner on the Game Boy Advance, published by Success Corporation. Aside from the rather fetching graphical style, it doesn't bring anything new to the table, but it does represent a faithful Lode Runner experience on a portable system, and at the time that was enough of an achievement in itself. A few years later, in 2005, Hudson saw fit to re-release their original Famicom game, which itself was over 20 years old by this point. Here's the same thing again, complete with the scrolling, which still sucks. And then they did it again! 2006's Lode Runner DS is a slightly graphically enhanced version of the same game, with the same scrolling issue. At least we have a minimap this time. Perhaps you're looking for something a little more vintage in your handheld puzzle platforming. Look no further than Lode Runner Classic, released in 2012 for iOS and Android. Aside from some predictably imprecise touchscreen controls, the baffling inclusion of tilt controls, and the ability to customise the game's colours, it's the Apple II original all over again. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. As you're probably picking up on, innovation wasn't really on the cards this side of Lode Runner 2. In fact, the entire franchise started to peter out a little bit at this point. That's not to say we didn't have anything new, however, as evidenced by 2009's Lode Runner for Xbox 360. They also stuck this one on mobile devices about 6 years later, with the new title, Lode Runner X. It's got cool 3D graphics and a protagonist who looks like Rad Spencer as designed by Committee. The Mad Monks make a bit of a return and, who am I kidding, it's no different to any other blasted game in this series. I know I said earlier that Lode Runner strikes a perfect balance, but could they have at least tried to push the envelope with these games? The only thing this one does any differently is to include these little platforming sections in between each level. Actually, I may have spoken too soon. This one's actually got some interesting stuff going for it. Each of the new environments has a special block type, which react differently to what you might expect. The trapdoors, as seen in the factory levels, have been a Lode Runner staple since day one, but in addition to those you've got things like snow blocks and lava blocks. Add to that a couple of very tiny changes to the rule set, and it actually makes for a pretty fresh Lode Runner adventure. You also have a couple of extra game modes. Hang On is a more action-oriented game, which spawns more and more monsters, and challenges you to survive just like I didn't. Puzzle mode, on the other hand, has no enemies at all, allowing the platforming to take the limelight. This mode is just you, your laser drill pistol, and a lot of very tricky blocks to blast. The 3D graphics, nice as they are, do make the game feel imprecise, an issue only exacerbated by the frankly pathetic Xbox 360 D-pad. Despite that though, this newfangled Lode Runner is a pleasant surprise, making some welcome changes to an otherwise pretty conventional entry. And in case you hadn't had enough of same game new graphics, and in case this series' naming convention wasn't confusing enough, there's also Lode Runner 1. Work that one out. Beyond this smattering of releases though, the Lode Runner franchise had, and has, kind of stagnated a little. Especially since the game's newest entry is itself 7 years old. Lode Runner Legacy is a modern interpretation of everyone's favourite puzzle platformer. It's got gold, it's got blocks, it's got digging, it's refined, if pretty standard. The voxel-based art style makes perfect sense for a game like this. It's obvious where the block boundaries start and end, and there are some new effects which show how close a block is to regrowing itself. There's also a subtle colour difference with any block you currently stood on, which is handy because the digging controls felt a touch on the imprecise side. And the guards appear to sweat profusely when they're carrying gold. Anyhow, all this goes to ensure a level of readability that could have easily been lost, given it's otherwise presented in 3D. Speaking of which, there's the option of a second camera mode which I couldn't make head nor tail of. My first thought is that it's for VR purposes, but there's no mention of that on the store page, So perhaps it's just another one of the game's puzzles. Of which there are plenty. You get 100 new levels split across 2 different modes. Adventure comprises your traditional running of Lodes, although it's actually a castle full of, well, I'm not sure, mad knights maybe? They're accompanied by 2 new enemy types too, which themselves present additional puzzle opportunities. Crawlers can climb on walls and ceilings and can't be trapped, unless the ground rebuilds itself at the exact right time. Digs can plough through any wall in their way, and bombs are pretty self-explanatory. We also have another puzzle mode, just like the Xbox 360 game. In addition to their presence in the main adventure mode, all of this new stuff can be used in the level editor, although you can only have 1 enemy type per level, which limits your options somewhat. On the plus side, there are 3 different sizes of board to pick from. On top of this, you have the option to create a whole new character or item skin, which you can then use in your own levels. This built-in voxel editor is a bit clumsy and not especially feature-packed, but it's still pretty cool to see. One particularly nice new feature, which has been surprisingly absent until now, is the ability to browse user-created boards, characters and treasure. I was very surprised not only at the lack of non-PG content, but also at the amount of classic arcade game representation on display here. Ever wanted a Lode Runner where you play as Pac-Man, specifically as Pac-Man design with the little hat, stealing power stars from the cats from Mappy? There are some seriously deep cuts here, including Jake Peril and the Mad Monks, the Galaxip, the laser base and aliens from Return of the Invaders, Bomberman, and that's just the characters. Of course, the greatest treasure is a Famicom with a copy of Lode Runner, but if you really want to steal mittens from kittens, the option is there. Oh, and there are a ton of user levels too, but that was probably a given. Beyond that, it's a straightforward Lode Runner. With a name like Legacy, you might expect that it would go a bit further to harken back to older games in the series. And it kind of does, insofar as most of these games have been extremely similar to each other. It does include the entire set of 150 levels from the Apple II original, albeit with slightly different AI which doesn't quite act the same. Its player and enemy designs also appear to be based on those from the Irem arcade games, which is a really nice touch. And if you missed the red-nosed fellas from the first game, guess what? They're downloadable too. What it doesn't have are any items at all, which feels a bit of a missed opportunity. Even if they weren't included in the main adventure mode, Totosai could have given us the various bombs, traps and other assorted accoutrements from the Presage games to use in our own levels. How fun would it have been to have included every board from every previous Lode Runner game? It would have been a lot of work for sure, but that would have been a true celebration of this series' legacy. It could have been the Super Mario Maker of the Lode Runner franchise. As it stands, it's possibly the best official way to play Lode Runner today. And it's not a bad game at all, because it's a competently built Lode Runner game, thereby making it impossible to be bad. Notice I said possibly, because Lode Runner's legacy doesn't actually end there. You see, there may have been 1,000,001 official Lode Runner games, but there have also been scores of unofficial games for various different platforms, some of which bend the formula in inventive ways, but most of which are straight clones of the original. Like ZX Games' Lode Runner, which allows you to dig while running, decreasing the game's difficulty quite significantly. Or K-Gold Runner, an open source clone from KDE which plays a bit fast and loose with the rules, but it does take place inside a computer, a heartwarmingly mid-90s concept. Over on the Amiga you've got Mine Runner, which I alluded to earlier. For the PC you have Jetpack, which isn't strictly a Lode Runner clone but definitely takes quite a few cues from its design. Later on we had Lode Doomer, which was the first Lode Runner game I ever played. Its pre-rendered 3D graphics aren't a patch on those from the Dig Fight or Lode Runner 2. If you want a truly chaotic game of Lode Runner, look no further than the delightful Escapade, developed by the crowning king of bonkers shareware, Steve Morath. As you can see, Lode Runner is as much a hit in the indie space as it was at the time of its release. Given its history, it only makes sense. I'm sure if Doug had come up with the concept a little later, it would have been a shoo-in for the shareware release model. Speaking of Doug, well, it would have been fantastic to hear from the man himself about the history of his game. Sadly, in September 2014, he passed away. Comments about him following the news speak of him in the most positive of ways, and there are even some fascinating tidbits from people who knew him around the time of Lode Runner's release. For example, to get the required 150 levels as part of the contract with Broderbund, he enlisted kids from the neighbourhood and let them loose on the game's level editor. For a fee, of course. Should also mention that while we didn't hear much again from James Bratsanos, one of the co-creators of the first game, he wasn't left in the lurch. Doug bought his half of the game for a flat fee, fair and square. In fact, both Doug and James provided a bit of their own histories with the game in issue 111 of Retro Gamer magazine. Doug even talks about some of the newer entries in the series. While he wasn't especially fond of the N64 game, he did get a kick out of the Xbox 360 version. It's a great feature and well worth a read if you get the opportunity. Still no idea about Tracy Steinbeck though. While Doug is no longer with us, his name lives on in his perfect little platformer. And it's still going, because there's been a significant omission here, and that is the Atari 2600. Typically it's been the first on the scene whenever an exciting new arcade game is involved. Well, it finally got its fair share of Lode Runner as recently as 2022, when a team of developers released a brand new version, with Toadside's blessing even. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's evidence that this game is still such a beloved piece of work over 40 years later. So much so that one could even argue it was the genesis of the cinematic platformer. Jordan Mechner cites it as an inspiration following the release of Karateka, and states that his later game, Prince of Persia, was essentially the gameplay of Lode Runner interwoven with the cinematography of Karateka. Looking at the final result, you'd see how this would have come about. So, if you wanted to play Lode Runner today, what's the best option? As well as Lode Runner Legacy, which is still available on Steam, there is a web version of the game called Lode Runner Total Recall, a faithful adaptation of the Apple II original. It features a few hundred boards drawn from a variety of sources, both official and unofficial, including the classic set of 150 and the additional levels featured in Championship. It also includes a training mode as well as a demo mode, allowing you to view the solution to each level. But if you're partial to Pressage's profferings, you'll be glad to know that Mad Monk's Revenge was released as freeware circa 2002 by its lead programmer Beth Daggett. Her now defunct website also featured a bit more information about the game's development, and listed a few of the accolades it picked up at the time of release. Beth highlights one award in particular, the Best New Arcade Game Award from Games Magazine, which it achieved alongside such greats as Myst and... gosh, we do seem to be running into XCOM a lot today, don't we? So, not only is what many would consider the definitive Lode Runner experience completely free, it's also had its own modern re-implementation project, in the form of Mad Monk's Revenge Definitive Edition. Created by Lode Runner devotees Quark Robot, this version is a much more up-to-date rewrite of that crusty old Windows 95 code. And eagle-eyed viewers will have noticed that's the version we played earlier on in this video. All the features of the original are represented, as well as doubling the multiplayer capabilities to allow for 4-player frolics, plus different rule sets depending on how you want to play, and native compatibility with Windows, macOS and Linux. No bosses though. And in case that wasn't enough, they're currently giving Lode Runner 2 the same treatment, which is good because it's a pain in the arse to get going otherwise. Whichever way you decide to play, classic or modern, official or unofficial, feature packed or pared back, you're in for one heck of an adventure.